Okay, welcome. My name is Jackie Jacob. I'm at the University of Kentucky and I coordinate the Small and Backyard Flocks Community of Practice. And we put on a weekly webinar. This month's webinar is on culling standards for small and backyard flocks, as you can see from the title. In January, we'll be looking at avian genetics and an introduction to poultry breeding. And then in February, we have predator control for small and backyard flocks. So I hope you'll join us for future ones as well as joining us for today. We have many different webinars that we've held in the past, and all the recordings are up on our website. I'll put in the chat box the link to the webinars and our Facebook page where we highlight which were the upcoming webinars. So as I said, our webinar for today is setting culling standards for small and backyard flocks. And our speaker for today is Dr. Gregory Martin out of Penn State University. All yours.
Well, thank you for allowing me to come in and speak today about culling. It's something that we have in the past done on an ongoing basis. Let's see if I can get this to go. There we go. And it's something that I actually done commercially when I was working on a large layer facility. We would normally go in and cull our flocks once a year. And so this is something that I actually did as a practice, and it's something that you can practice with a flock of any size. So we're going to cover a little bit about why do we cull in the first place, and when to cull a flock, what to look for when you're culling, how to properly dispose and dispatch poultry, that's to euthanize and dispose. And we'll talk a little bit about the kind of the thinking of the standard. What are we looking for when we're considering culling a particular individual out of a flock? So why do this? There's a number of reasons, and there's some that are very obvious, but there are some that kind of you don't think about, simply because a lot of times you're looking at the birds and you're looking at the flock and you really don't think of the birds as individuals. You look at them as a group. And a lot of times you'll miss some things that you need to concentrate on as you're looking at them individually. So first of all, and the obvious one that I would say that you need to cull is for birds that are truly injured and can't really continue a normal course of life. So these are birds that are crippled or injured in some way that they are never going to achieve their optimum genetic potential in the flock, and they may be subject to being bullied or picked on by other individuals. So rather than seeing them go down a spiral, death spiral, basically, as they get further and further cannibalized or injured, it's better to dispatch these birds and cull them out of the flock. The other is, in meat birds especially, we see this, is that birds that are not gaining weight for one reason or another, either by disease or malformation or something like that, that the birds just aren't progressing, that their weight will never achieve market weight in a reasonable amount of time. And so we will look at culling those birds out so that they will give that portion of their feed to the rest of the flock mates so that they would be able to achieve their target weights in due course. It's a little bit cheaper than that as well. So we're looking also for birds on the egg side that aren't really producing eggs for an extended period of time. Birds that are continually pausing are birds that have gone broody due to age or injury, and they're not laying any eggs and probably will not lay eggs into the future at all. And so here's birds that are eating feed and not laying any eggs at all. And then we cull, especially when we have high feed costs. And so if you're feeding birds a special diet, this is especially true in organic flocks because organic feed typically is a premium type of feed. You're feeding a high cost ration to birds that may not be very productive. And so you have to look at the cost-benefit ratio of holding these birds or carrying these birds in the flock when they're not really contributing anything back to substantiate that purchase of high cost feeds. And then lastly, sometimes we're culling birds because they're birds that are not destined for further purposes in time within the flock. When we have breeding stock, for example, and you have extra roosters, holding extra roosters in a flock actually is detrimental to the flock because of the fighting that would take place within the flock. And so sometimes we will actually reduce numbers of roosters in a flock to maintain good decorum within the flock and to have a proper sex ratio between individuals. We're also looking at birds. If they're breeders, you want them to be type specific to the breed and variety. And so any bird that would impart a departure from that breed type, you would not want to keep in the flock, and you would actually either sell the bird or cull the bird out of the flock, which would mean, taking them out of your particular flock and moving forward. So one way of looking at culling is looking at the average within the flock. If we're talking about egg production or meat production, I typically go back to the idea of a binomial curve, a normal curve, where we would have a group of birds that would have an average weight, for example, and then we would have birds that would be heavier than that average weight, and then we would have birds that might be lighter than that average weight. And this could be the same with laying hens too. Where we would have an average production level here, and maybe number of eggs per bird, and you'll have some birds that will lay more eggs than the average, and some birds that will lay less than the average. And so typically when I'm looking at a culling standard, I normally look at the idea of using a number that would give me birds that would be within that standard deviation. And so, for example, if I had birds that were 3 pounds laying hens and I was looking at a measure of body weight, I could possibly cull birds that were 2 times the standard deviation of that flock. So about almost 40% here below the mean. I would be looking for that weight target that would tell me that. So for a flock that is looking at 3 pound average here at the mean, I'm looking at birds that are about 1.6 pounds or lighter and culling those birds from the flock, simply because with these birds here in the lighter end of the tail, they're not going to perform as well as the average, or even those that are performing better than the average in the flock. So you'd like to have your birds stay within the mean, close to the mean, so that they all behave the same. But if we're looking at egg production especially, we're not going to hurt the flock by having birds that are performing better than the mean. But conversely, birds that are not performing well in comparison to the mean, those would be birds that we would consider to look at, individually look at, and see why are they not performing. It could be either injury or that the birds have stopped laying eggs, and those birds would need to be culled. So when you think about it, look for an average, and then what would be the lowest part of that average distribution in your flock, and then use that as a standard for culling. So to put some dollars and cents to this too, what if I had birds that weren't laying eggs? They were continuing to eat fine, they were mobile, they're walking around, but for some reason or another they went broody and they're not laying any eggs at all. This could be a flock, at peak production too, and we're having birds that have stopped laying eggs. So a bird that was eating a 1/4 pound of feed per day, and the feed was $18 for a 50-pound bag of feed. In those 90 days, that bird would cost me $8.10 to keep that bird in the flock. And so this is a decision point that you would have to make to figure out if indeed is it worth keeping a bird for $8.10 every 90 days. For some of you that keep birds as a hobby or as a, it's a pleasure to keep them around, you just like looking at birds and having them there, that's okay. But for some of you that are holding a flock of birds and you're trying to get production out of them, and you're feeding a special feed or fortified feed or some other specialty egg that you're trying to produce, this is a cost consideration that you may use as a method for determining when to cull your flock. So when to cull a flock? With layers, it's best to cull around June and August. Now, the reason why I say that is usually in-season flocks are peaking around June, and you would assume that if they are truly peaking and you have 90% production, for example, most of the birds should be showing signs of production. If you have a bird that looks broody or out of production at this point in time, chances are there's something wrong with that bird, that the bird will not be returning back into production. Culling in August is important because as we go into shorter day lengths, you don't want to cull a bird because it may look like it's going through a molt, or a bird that's pausing just because of natural conditions. And so you want to cull before August, before the birds go into a molt. Sometimes this molting process is very stressful on a bird, and so a bird that's not going to carry through a molt and it's going to die anyway, it might be time to sell that bird as a soup type chicken, or a salvage type bird, rather than lose it to mortality through a molt. You don't want to cull a bird that you would know would go through a molt and come back and be rejuvenated and very productive. And so that's why you don't want to really go past August first, simply because the natural conditions will probably put some of these birds into a pause. So that's important. So culling before selling down a flock is important too, because you want to keep the birds, your best birds, and you want to sell the birds that are not as productive. And then birds that are throughout the production cycle, sometimes you will mark. I use spray paint, for example, on white feathered birds, and I will spray paint birds that I think are broody, just to see if they'll come back into production. And if they don't, after repeated visits to them, we go ahead and cull those birds. With broilers and turkeys, usually the first week we're culling birds that are not going to be ambulatory, birds that are failing to thrive, and birds that will probably be well under flock standard by market weight. And so that's why culling, especially in the first weeks, are usually done to make sure that the flock stays as uniform as possible throughout the grow period that each type of bird is under. So when we're looking at laying hens, for example, there are telltale features on the birds that we can use as an indicator of past production in the hens. We actually teach this as evaluation classes at colleges and within our FFA and 4-H programs. And so when we see hens that have bright eyes, well-formed combs and wattles, and a depletion in their pigmentation in their faces and in their beaks and in their shanks, that's typically a good indicator of good production. Birds that don't have that and they kind of revert to a look, almost they look like a pullet within the flock of layers, typically those are birds that we look at to cull. And so we would have a cull bird here on our left and a fully productive bird on our right. You can also see that there is quite a bit of color. When we feed birds corn, typically that pigmentation will settle in the various parts of the bird. And so those are usually telltale signs when they're carrying this much color in peak production that these birds are also culls. There's a sequencing of color loss in a bird. So as they lay eggs, we see losses of color. And this is both true of white egg shell layers as well as brown shell layers. And so the first place to see a loss would be around the ring of the vent, around the vent, and then the eye ring and earlobe of the bird. Usually the eye ring I can see a little bit better than the earlobe. And then we look at the beak, and it goes from the base of the beak to the tip of the beak. And then lastly, around the legs, we look to see how the color goes. And then as they lose color here, you'll see a loss of pigmentation, because that pigmentation is being moved from the body stores of fat in the bird to the pigment within the yolk. And so as they're laying eggs, more and more of that pigment is leaving the body. And so we can age a bird as far as their production as they, what we call, bleach out. They lose the pigment within their bodies. So bleaching is a good indicator of whether you have a productive hen in the past within your flock or not. If I have to make a decision to cull between a bird that's carrying a lot of color in its body versus a bird that's very well bleached, I'm going to continue to pick the bird that's well bleached to keep in my flock, simply because she'll probably have good, her body is well conditioned and able to sustain lay a little bit better than the bird that is pausing too often. So a lot of times we also look at body conformation as well as pigmentation within the bird. And so the conformation is a very important feature, because we want birds, especially laying hens, to have kind of a rectangular body shape. And that's because we need space for not only the digestive section of the organs here, but also the reproductive tract here, where the eggs are formed here in the ovary, the ova. The yolk portion is released, goes through the oviduct, and then the whites and shell gland, or the shell, is placed on the egg and then out through the back of the bird. Birds that are not very productive actually will regress their oviducts, and their body shape actually becomes more triangular rather than rectangular. And so when we look at birds, you need to think about them as whether they are more rectangular or are they more triangular in shape. And you'll actually see this as you handle the birds. If you hold the bird and using your hand feel in the back of the bird, you'll actually look for two key features in the bird. You're looking for the tip of the sternum or the keel bone here, and there's two pubis bones that forms part of the pelvic girdle. And so you're looking at the gap between the pubis and the keel. As the bird lays more and more eggs, this distance here spreads as more and more eggs pass out the bird. As the bird goes broody, this distance will shrink down, and it's a good indicator whether the bird has been laying eggs for a period of time. And so when we're culling birds and the birds look identical in bleaching, I always go back to this body characteristic to see if indeed the bird is actually in pause or not. As the bird stops laying eggs, this distance will close, and so what we're looking at from the back of the bird is something that looks like this, where we want a bird that is like this, where we have a longer distance between the pubis bones and the keel, versus a bird that's not productive, where the distance is very, very short. And so you want birds that have adequate capacity so that they can maintain good egg production. And that's why we would cull birds that would look like this. You know, in the middle of a peak, if birds look like this, they may never come back into lay. And so you want to keep birds in the flock that are very uniform and have this type of structure to their bodies. So when we are culling,
Yes. Can I interrupt before you start talking about methods of culling?
Sure.
We have a question. Elaine asks, where I live, high heat suppresses production during June and August, and her entire flock shut down almost completely last summer because it got hot so fast. Any ideas on when I might decide on culling?
Wow. Is that even with amending your environment with maybe evaporative cooling or fans?
Yeah.
If you're able to relieve some of that heat, then you might be able to make a judgment on it. Otherwise, I would have to do it in the middle of winter, which would be a kind of a dicey situation.
Yeah, Elaine's the one in California,
Right.
the high desert area.
Yeah.
She has no fans but lots of water, no relief on the heat, unfortunately.
Wow. One simple way to do that would be to set up a rainbird sprinkler around the perimeter of your poultry pens, so that you would get some evaporative cooling around the pens. That would keep the floors dry where the hens are, and so that if they laid a floor egg, you wouldn't have a mud covered egg, but still have enough heat loss around the pens to give them some relief. But yeah, a flock like that, you'd almost have to wait till wintertime to see if they would, be able to be culled, because you're going to have a lot of pausing from heat prostration and a lot of misshapen eggs or soft-shelled eggs during that heat stress.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions so far on culling standards before we get into the culling methods?
Yeah, I did want it to become a math lesson, but I always think about it as 2/3 and 1/3. 1/3 of my flock might not be the best, and so that's what I'm looking for, that 1/3 in my flock that just isn't looking very good. It doesn't look like the rest of them. It kind of reminds me of Sesame Street. One of these things doesn't look like the other. One of these things is not the same. That's what you're looking for when you're culling.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I will go on mute again and let you continue. Again, if you have any questions, just type them in the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on them and get you if you have a question.
Okay, so the best way, especially with smaller flocks, or if you're doing just a few culls from time to time, there's about 4 or 5 ways of properly dispatching these birds when you're culling. Of course, if you have a live bird market available to you, you could take your birds live to a live bird market and sell them. That's what some farms do, and that's what we did in the particular farm that we had. We would sell our cull birds, and they would become soup. Very desirable product for others out there. And so I forgot to include marketing as part of a proper culling method. But for some of you that might be isolated, or your birds are so far incapacitated that they cannot be sold, you might want to look at the 4 methods of culling or euthanizing these birds as you cull. The most popular one that I see out there is cervical dislocation. And there's a picture here of the proper method that I like to show folks to do. That's where you brace the head of the bird against your leg with the chin up all the way, and that puts the proper angle on the neck, so that as you pull steadily with the feet, you pull steadily on the feet, the neck will separate from the top of the neck. And so what you want to do is you continue to pull, and sometimes you'll get involuntary wing flapping. Continue to pull until you feel that separation happen. Stop pulling at that point in time, you're finished. But then go ahead and verify that there is a separation between the head and the neck of the bird, so that you could close the skin between your fingers. That's very important, because I've actually had veterinarians not do a very good job of cervical dislocation, and we had a pile of birds that I thought were dead come to life on us. I call them Lazarus birds, and that's not the proper way of dispatching these birds. So it should be quick, it should be final, it should be irrevocable. That's what good euthanasia is. So properly dislocating is an important thing. It's always a good thing to teach. If you're teaching this, always teach folks on dead birds first, and that helps get them used to the idea of what they're feeling for as they do this. Conversely, if you don't want to do cervical dislocation, you can use exsanguination. That's basically cutting the jugular vein as if you were processing these birds, and let them bleed out. They lose consciousness, and then they finally die after they lose consciousness. In some areas, blunt force trauma is used. This is especially true of younger birds like chicks, baby chicks. They can be dispatched very quickly with blunt force trauma. It has to be administered very quickly and one blow only. And then lastly, you can rig up a simple gas chamber with a garbage can with a tight-fitting lid and use CO2 gas or argon gas. You can get these gases at a welding supply and do this outside of the building and fill the container with gas. It displaces the oxygen and the birds die within 2 minutes. So when we cull, especially when we are euthanizing birds, it's important to handle the dead correctly. That includes a proper method of disposal. Some of the recommendations I make include burial, either on property or if you have garbage service. A lot of times they will pick up small poultry very easily. I always recommend double bagging these birds before you put them in your dumpsters. Simply, it helps keep vermin and dogs and other things from getting to them. Composting is a very desirable way of getting disposing of culls. It needs to be done correctly. As you can see here, here's a very simple hog wire ring that has chips with a sawdust top. You basically would put a foot of chips at the bottom of this ring, lay your birds in there, and then cover them with at least 6 to 8 inches of top cover, and then you would continue to build the pile as you were adding birds to it. In some areas, some people have incinerators. These are gas-fired or diesel-fired ovens with brick. They're brick-lined, and they are smokeless. They incinerate, cremate the birds very quickly. There's also rendering sometimes in your area. These are folks that pick up dead animals and they are rendered for meat and fat. So there's some of those in your area depending. You'd have to check your area to see if they have a facility close to you. Whichever method you use, it's important to take your birds seriously and to treat them with some respect. I kind of go ballistic a little bit when I see birds being thrown around at a poultry farm. That's not the intended way of handling them, and so you need to be respectful of them. They are a source of pride and are earning, and so you should treat them with the respect that they're due. So with that, that's a very short discussion on culling. It's something that has been practiced for years and years. I have seen some articles back in the 20s that talked about culling, simply because what you're doing is you're strengthening the flock by taking those individuals out, giving room to the ones that are remaining, and hopefully you're putting good money after good birds. And so with that, I'll leave you back to Jackie.
Okay, so we have lots of time for questions. If anybody has any questions to ask. I know we had one participant who only had 6 birds. And I know that, for a backyard flock, I would think that that disease symptoms and when can you not cure a bird would be an important defining time for culling if you've got backyard birds that you really don't want to lose.
Well, the other thing too is, yeah, so we have birds that they're showing symptoms of disease, and now you've moved them into a quarantine area on your farm, and they're not responding to treatment, or they're continuing to get very, very what we call chronic, and they have no hope of coming back. This is the point in time where you got to make a decision that I'm going to put this bird down to save the rest of my flock, because for one reason or another, sometimes, a disease will move through a flock very quickly if it's a very virulent type of viral infection. And so a lot of times we will cull birds that are very, very sick when we know they're not going to be recoverable. The other part of this too, Jackie, is that, birds don't lay eggs forever. They have a 12-year lifespan, but their productive life is usually between 2 and 3 years. So, 2/3 of their life could be spent eating feed and doing nothing. So the question is, am I going to keep these birds around and feed them, or am I going to go ahead and cull them and make room for new birds that are going to be productive and feed my family? So for some people, they're pets, and so they're going to just keep their birds till they die, and that's okay. But for some, because of the feed that they're feeding, the costs are a little bit expensive. They want to be cost effective. So, you could look at your flock and say, okay, some of these older birds, we're going to go ahead and put down and make them into soup, or just put them down and cull them, so that we can make room for birds that are going to be more and more productive.
Right. She did say that she was planning more birds in the future. So I guess it's not so much a backyard flock. We also had another question from Brenda. Won't a brooding hen come back into lay?
It depends. Sometimes, yes, they will. Typically, a bird will lay a clutch of 15 eggs and then go broody to brood those eggs till they hatch. But if you're in a situation where you're removing the eggs daily and you have a bird that's gone broody and is like fighting you on the nest, sometimes I've seen broody hens commandeer a clutch of eggs that, were laid and just fight you tooth and nail. I usually mark those birds just to see if they'll come out of it. Sometimes they will, but sometimes they'll have an injury inside their oviduct that they're not going to come back out of it. And so they're just going to be broody birds forever, and that's a cull bird that we're going to cull.
Okay. Any more questions? Give people time to type if they're typing. Again, I hope you'll join us for future ones, especially those that are doing any breeding. Avian Genetics and Introduction to Poultry Breeding is January 12th, and Predator Control for Small and Backyard Flocks is February the 7th. If you have ideas for topics, please feel free to email me. Let me put my email here. We always try to get our things going well in advance, so we can get our speakers ready. So feel free to email me any of your topics that you would like to see. Go to our main page and see if there's one there already, or if you would, if you want one updated, we can do that too. Extension, oops, can't even do it. .org/poultry will take you to our list, and just look under past webinars. We have a whole slew on them: hatcheries, poultry equipment, avian influenza, meat quality issues. We have a lot of 4-H things, biosecurity, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not seeing any more questions, Greg.
Very good.
So I think that we are finished. Thank you guys for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again in a future webinar. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, Mark.
Thank you.